Someone get that vagrant away from the sight lines. Commander Bryce Kendrick's voice cut across the pristine Naval Academy lawn like a blade through silk, his perfectly pressed whites catching the morning sun as he gestured toward the far edge of the public viewing area. Two security personnel turned to follow his gaze, and what they saw was exactly what Kendrick saw. An old man, weathered face mapped with lines that spoke of decades and damage. Gray hair that hadn't seen a proper barber in what looked like years. A jacket held together more by hope than by thread. Patches of duct tape visible along the seams where the fabric had simply given up. The old man stood behind a massive oak tree at the boundary of the public space, half hidden in its shadow, watching the rows of white chairs filling with proud families and distinguished guests. His boots were held together with electrical tape, wrapped so many times the original leather was barely visible. His hands, rough and cracked from years of labor, clutched something small against his chest. Elias Vance had walked 14 miles to stand in this spot. He had left his place under the Key Bridge before dawn, moving through Baltimore's sleeping streets with the kind of quiet purpose that had once carried him through jungles and deserts and places that didn't exist on any map. His legs ached. His feet had gone numb somewhere around mile 11. None of it mattered. Today his daughters were graduating from the United States Naval Academy. The ceremony grounds stretched before him in immaculate perfection. Rows upon rows of white folding chairs arranged with military precision across the manicured lawn. A stage draped in naval tradition, flags catching the late May breeze. Midshipmen in their dress whites filing into position. For years of transformation about to culminate in the moment they would become officers. Families clutched programs and tissues, cameras ready, pride radiating from every face. Elias could not see his daughters clearly from this distance. They were somewhere in that sea of white uniforms, two identical faces he had memorized before they could walk, two voices he still heard in his dreams. Sophia and Natalia, his twins, his everything. He had not spoken to them in 5 years, 11 months, and 23 days. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where 2 sets of dog tags hung on a single chain alongside a gold wedding band. The metal was warm against his skin, carried there so long it had become part of him. His tags, her ring, and one more set of tags that belonged to a man who had died in his arms 36 years ago in a Panamanian jungle. Before we continue this story, we would love to know where you're watching from today. Leave a comment below telling us your city or country. Stories like this one remind us that quiet legends walk among us in every community, and you might have someone in your own life whose humble appearance hides extraordinary sacrifice. If stories about courage and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now, let us continue. Commander Kendrick was already moving across the lawn, his aides struggling to keep pace. The graduation ceremony coordinator had spent 11 months planning this day down to the minute. The Chief of Naval Operations would be arriving in 20 minutes. Senator Margaret Shunn, who sat on the Armed Services Committee, was already seated in the VIP section. Rear Admiral Theodore Marsh, retired, had taken his place of honor to watch his godson receive his commission. Every detail had been orchestrated, every contingency planned, every possible disruption anticipated. Except for the homeless man watching from the shadows. Kendrick approached the security perimeter, lowering his voice just enough to maintain decorum while making his displeasure absolutely clear. He told the senior petty officer on duty that he wanted that individual moved along immediately, before any of the VIP guests noticed and started questioning why the Academy could not maintain basic standards. Petty Officer First Class Diana Reyes, the young master-at-arms assigned to ceremony security, followed Kendrick's pointed finger toward the oak tree. She studied the old man for a long moment. Something about the way he stood caught her attention. Straight spine despite his obvious exhaustion. Weight balanced, hands still at his sides in a way that spoke of discipline rather than defeat. She had served with SEALs on her last deployment. She knew what controlled stillness looked like. But Kendrick was already moving toward the oak tree, and Reyes fell in behind him with the other security personnel, her instincts whispering something her training could not quite name. Elias saw them coming. 3 figures in uniform cutting across the perfect lawn toward his position. He had known this moment would likely come. He had hoped to remain invisible, just another face at the edge of the crowd, close enough to witness but far enough to disappear. He should have known better. Men like him did not disappear. They simply became harder to see. He did not run. He did not hide. He simply stood his ground and waited. The photograph of 2 8-year-old girls in matching sailor dresses pressed against his heart. Commander Kendrick stopped 3 feet away, his expression carrying the particular disdain reserved for those who disrupted carefully constructed order. His voice was polite in the way that expensive knives were polite, sharp and cold and designed to cut. "Sir, this is a private ceremony. I'm going to have to ask you to move along." Elias met his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse from disuse, rough with years of silence. But underneath it ran something steady, something that did not bend. "I am in the public viewing area, sir. I would just like to watch the graduation." The "sir" came out automatically, muscle memory from decades of military courtesy that no amount of time on the streets could erase. Kendrick noticed it. His lip curled slightly, the way it might if he had spotted a clever, but ultimately transparent attempt at manipulation. He gave Elias 5 minutes to relocate voluntarily. After that, security would escort him off the grounds. This was not a negotiation. Then he turned and walked back toward the ceremony area, confident that the matter was handled, already moving on to his next checklist item. But what Commander Kendrick did not know, what he could not possibly have known as he strode across that immaculate lawn, was that in exactly 43 minutes his obsession with perfection would bring him face to face with a man whose name was still spoken with reverence in the halls he walked every day. A man who had trained warriors. A man who had earned a call sign in blood and darkness that still echoed through the teams like a ghost story told to frightened trainees. In 43 minutes, Commander Bryce Kendrick would learn what payback really meant. The 5 minutes passed like water through his fingers. Elias remained exactly where he stood, watching the ceremony grounds fill with the last arriving families, watching the midshipmen take their final positions, watching everything he had lost arrange itself in a perfect rows before him. He thought about Elena. She had been the one who convinced him to retire. 22 years in the teams, more deployments than he could count on both hands, a body that had started to betray him in small ways that added up to something undeniable. He had resisted at first. The teams were not just his career. They were his identity, his family, the only place he had ever truly belonged. But Elena had looked at him with those dark eyes that saw through every wall he had ever built, and she had said something that changed everything. She told him that he had spent 2 decades being a weapon. Maybe it was time to try being a father. The twins had been 16 then, Sophia and Natalia. 2 girls who looked exactly like their mother and moved through the world with a confidence that terrified him. He had missed so much of their childhood. Birthdays reduced to satellite phone calls. School plays he learned about months after the curtain fell. The slow miracle of watching children become people, experienced only in fragments between deployments. He retired 3 weeks later, and for 6 years, he learned what it meant to be present. To sit on the porch with Elena watching the sunset paint the Chesapeake orange and gold. To teach his daughters about the constellations using the same battered astronomy book his own father had used, the one he had carried through every war zone like a talisman. To feel the violence drain out of him one quiet evening at a time, until he almost believed he could be something other than what the teams had made him. Then Elena got sick. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors used words like aggressive and inoperable and palliative care. Elias heard none of it. He only heard the sound of his entire world collapsing into a single point of unbearable pressure. She fought for 7 months. He held her hand through every treatment, every setback, every moment when hope flickered and died and somehow flickered again. The girls came home from their first year at the Naval Academy, and together the three of them kept vigil as Elena Vance slowly disappeared from the world she had made beautiful. Her last words to him were a command. "Go back to them, Eli. Promise me. They need their father." He promised. He held her hand and felt her grip weaken, and he promised with everything he had. 3 weeks after the funeral, he broke that promise. He could not explain it, not then and not now. He would look at Sophia and see Elena's smile. He would hear Natalia laugh and hear Elena's voice underneath it. Every room in their house was saturated with her absence. Every photograph a wound that would not close. He had survived things that should have killed him. He had held dying men in his arms and kept moving. But this grief was something different. This grief was a darkness that swallowed him whole. He left a note on the kitchen table. 5 sentences that he had rewritten 100 times and still got wrong. "I love you both more than my own life. But every time I look at you, I see her. Live your lives. Do not look for me. I am so sorry." Then he walked out the door and did not stop walking until the world forgot his name. The streets taught him things the teams never had. How to find warmth when the shelters were full. Which docks hired day laborers with no questions asked. How to stretch $3 across 2 days. How to become invisible in a world that preferred not to see men like him. He worked the Baltimore harbor when he could. Loading ships. Holding cargo. Manual labor that left his body exhausted enough to sleep without dreaming. The younger workers called him old-timer and gave him the jobs no one else wanted. He never complained. He never explained. He simply showed up and worked and disappeared back into the shadows when the shift was done. But he never stopped watching his daughters. He was there when they returned to the academy for their 2nd year, standing across the street from the bus station in clothes he had pulled from a donation bin. He was there for their commissioning ceremony into the 2nd class, hidden in a crowd of tourists near the harbor. He tracked their achievements through public Navy announcements, through local newspaper articles, through the pride in strangers' voices when they spoke about the Vance twins who were making history. 2 daughters, both at the academy, both rising through the ranks with the same relentless determination their father had once been known for. Both becoming the officers he had always believed they could be. And both, he knew, still looking for him. He had seen the missing person flyers. His own face staring back at him from telephone poles and community boards. The photograph from his retirement ceremony, making him look like a stranger. "Have you seen this man? Elias Vance, beloved father. Please contact." The words blurred every time he read them. They had never stopped searching. 5 years, 11 months, and 23 days, and his daughters had never stopped believing he was still alive. Never stopped hoping he would come home. He did not deserve that hope. He knew that. He had abandoned them in their darkest moment, left them to grieve alone, broken the only promise that had ever truly mattered. What kind of father did that? What kind of man? But still he watched. Still he followed their lives from the shadows. Still he kept the photograph of 2 8-year-old girls in sailor dresses pressed against his heart, like a prayer he no longer had the right to speak. And now they were graduating. Now they were about to become ensigns in the United States Navy, following in footsteps he had tried so hard to erase. He had walked 14 miles on feet that had gone numb just to see this moment, just to watch from a distance as his daughters completed the journey he had started for them before they were even born. He did not expect forgiveness. He did not deserve reunion. He only wanted to see them one more time, to know that they had made it, to carry that knowledge with him into whatever darkness still waited. The security personnel were returning. Commander Kendrick leading the way, his expression harder now, his patience clearly exhausted. 2 more officers flanked him. This time, Elias knew they would not be offering 5 minutes. His hand tightened on the photograph. Elena smiled up at him from the past, her arms around their daughters, all 3 of them caught in a moment of perfect happiness that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. "I am sorry," he whispered to no one. "I just wanted to see them graduate." But the words were lost in the wind, and Commander Kendrick was already close enough for Elias to see the contempt in his eyes. Commander Bryce Kendrick had built his entire career on the principle that excellence was not a goal, but a baseline. 17 years in the Navy had taught him that details mattered, that perception shaped reality, and that a single flaw in an otherwise perfect operation could unravel everything. He had coordinated fleet reviews. He had managed diplomatic visits that could have sparked international incidents. He had spent 11 months preparing for this graduation ceremony, and he was not about to let a homeless vagrant compromise the most important day on the Naval Academy calendar. The Chief of Naval Operations was arriving in 15 minutes. Senator Margaret Chun was already in her seat, reviewing her prepared remarks for the keynote address. Rear Admiral Theodore Marsh sat in the VIP section with the quiet dignity of a man who had earned his place through decades of distinguished service. News cameras were positioned at strategic intervals, ready to broadcast this celebration of naval tradition to audiences across the country. And at the edge of the public viewing area, partially hidden behind an oak tree, stood a man who looked like he had not seen a shower in weeks. Kendrick crossed the lawn with purpose, his aide and 2 security officers falling into formation behind him. The 5 minutes he had granted were a courtesy he rarely extended. The fact that the vagrant had not moved spoke to either profound stubbornness or profound stupidity. Either way, the situation was about to be resolved. Petty Officer Reyes kept pace with the group, her eyes never leaving the old man by the tree. Something continued to nag at her, some detail she could not quite identify. The way he tracked their approach without appearing to move his head. The way his weight stayed centered over his feet, balanced and ready despite his obvious exhaustion. Small things. Professional things. The kind of things you only noticed if you had spent time around operators. She told herself she was imagining it. The streets were full of veterans who had fallen through the cracks of a system that had used them up and thrown them away. Not all of them had been special. Most of them had simply been broken by circumstances beyond their control. This man was probably no different, but still she watched. Kendrick stopped directly in front of Elias, close enough to make his authority unmistakable. His voice carried the clipped precision of an officer accustomed to immediate compliance. Your 5 minutes are up. I gave you a chance to relocate voluntarily. That offer has expired. Elias met his gaze without flinching. The hoarseness in his voice had not changed, but something underneath it had hardened. He said he understood, and he appreciated the commander's patience. But he was standing in a public area, and he had every right to be there. He just wanted to watch the graduation. Kendrick's jaw tightened. He had dealt with difficult people before. Entitled parents who believed their connections exempted them from protocol. Foreign dignitaries who confused courtesy with weakness. Junior officers who mistook confidence for competence. But this was different. This was a homeless man in torn clothing who somehow believed he could stand his ground against the full weight of naval authority. The commander leaned closer, lowering his voice to something that was almost intimate in its contempt. He asked if Elias understood what was happening here today. The Chief of Naval Operations, United States senators, flag officers from every branch of the service, and him standing there in his rags, making families uncomfortable, drawing attention away from the midshipmen who had actually earned the right to be here. Elias said nothing. His eyes moved past Kendrick toward the ceremony grounds, searching the rows of white uniforms for 2 faces he would recognize anywhere. Kendrick followed his gaze and laughed. It was not a kind sound. He asked if Elias was looking for someone. Let him guess. Family graduating today. That was the story, right? Some long-lost relative who would be so happy to see him shambling out of the shadows. The words landed like blows, but Elias did not react. His voice remained steady when he spoke. He said yes. His daughters were graduating today. For a moment, Kendrick simply stared. Then his expression shifted into something that was almost pity, the kind of pity that contained more cruelty than compassion. He told Elias that he had heard every story in the book, every excuse, every desperate attempt to claim connection to something respectable. Homeless veterans claiming they had served with generals. Drifters insisting they had family in high places. All of it designed to buy sympathy, to extend the con, to squeeze a few more minutes of tolerance from people who had better things to do. He asked Elias what came next. Was he going to tell them he was a Navy SEAL too? The question hung in the air between them. Elias felt something shift in his chest, some old mechanism clicking into place. 30 years of training, 22 years of operations, a lifetime of learning when to speak and when to stay silent. He chose silence. Kendrick took it as confirmation of everything he already believed. He turned to the security officers and told them to escort this individual off academy grounds. If he resisted, they were authorized to detain him until local police could take custody. The security officers moved forward. Reyes hesitated, still watching the old man's hands, still waiting for something she could not name. Elias did not resist. He simply stood his ground and spoke one more time. His voice was quiet, but it carried. He said he was not asking for anything. He was not looking for a handout. He just wanted to stand here and watch his daughters become officers. That was all. Could they give him that? One of the security officers reached for his arm, and across the ceremony grounds, in the VIP section reserved for distinguished guests and flag officers, Rear Admiral Theodore Marsh glanced up from his program and noticed the commotion near the oak tree. He watched a cluster of security personnel surrounding what appeared to be an elderly homeless man. He saw Commander Kendrick gesturing emphatically. He observed the body language of confrontation, the familiar choreography of authority asserting itself over those who had none. He almost looked away. There were always small disturbances at these events, quickly handled and quickly forgotten. But something made him keep watching. Something about the way the old man stood. The stillness. The straight spine that did not bend, even as officers closed in around him. Marsh had seen that posture before. He had learned it himself, 32 years ago, from an instructor who had shaped him into the SEAL he eventually became. He set down his program and began to rise from his seat. The jungle had a smell that never left you. Rot and rain and something underneath that was older than memory. Elias had carried that smell in his lungs for 36 years, had tasted it in the back of his throat during quiet moments when the past reached up and dragged him under. Panama, December 1989. Operation Just Cause. He had been a chief petty officer then, 12 years in the teams, young enough to still believe he was invincible and experienced enough to know that belief was a lie. His platoon had been tasked with a compound extraction, a high-value target hiding in a jungle facility that officially did not exist. 16 SEALs moving through darkness toward coordinates that would not appear on any map. Marcus Okonkwo was on point. Petty Officer Second Class, call sign Mamba, the fastest operator Elias had ever worked with. They had come up through BUD/S together, Class 143, two men who had discovered that the only way to survive Hell Week was to stop thinking about survival and start thinking about the man beside you. Marcus had pulled Elias out of the surf when hypothermia started shutting down his limbs. Elias had carried Marcus through the last 4 miles of a conditioning run when his knee gave out. Brothers in everything but blood. The compound was supposed to be lightly defended. Intelligence had counted 12 hostiles, maximum. Standard extraction protocol. In and out before sunrise. Intelligence was wrong. They breached the perimeter at 0347 hours. Marcus went through the first door with Elias 2 steps behind. The muzzle flashes started before they cleared the threshold. Not 12 hostiles. 47. A trap that had been waiting for them like a jaw ready to snap shut. 3 SEALs went down in the first 30 seconds. Jacobson, Whitmore, Paulson, names that Elias still whispered to himself on the anniversary of their deaths. The platoon scattered into defensive positions, returning fire, tried to establish a foothold in a situation that had gone catastrophically wrong. Marcus made it to cover behind a concrete barrier. Elias was 10 feet away, pinned down by automatic fire from a second-floor window. They communicated in hand signals, the silent language of operators who had trained together so long they could read each other's thoughts. Marcus signaled that he was going to flank the window position. Elias signaled negative. 2 exposed. Wait for suppressing fire. But Marcus was already moving. He had always been too fast for his own good. The RPG came from a doorway they had cleared twice. A shooter who had been playing dead, waiting for his moment. Elias saw the flash, saw the trail of smoke cutting through the darkness, saw Marcus turn toward the sound a fraction of a second too late. The explosion threw Elias backward. When his vision cleared, Marcus was on the ground 15 feet away, his body armor shredded, blood pooling beneath him faster than seemed possible. Elias covered the distance without thinking. Bullets snapped past his head as he dropped to his knees beside his brother. The shrapnel had torn through Marcus's femoral artery. There was nothing to apply pressure to. There was only blood and more blood and the fading light in Marcus's eyes. Marcus grabbed his arm with a grip that was still strong, still desperate. His voice was a whisper that Elias had to lean close to hear. "Get them, brother. Make them pay." Then his hand went slack, and Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Okonkwo was gone. What happened next became legend in the teams. The kind of story that instructors told during the darkest hours of training, when candidates were ready to quit and needed to understand what a SEAL was truly capable of. Elias Vance went hunting. 19 hours, alone in the jungle. Every hostile who had been part of that ambush. He moved through the darkness like something that had stopped being human, fueled by grief so profound it had burned away everything except purpose. When the extraction team finally found him at dawn, he was sitting against a wall with his rifle across his knees, covered in blood that was not his own. The debrief lasted 6 hours. The commanding officer listened to Elias's after-action report with an expression that shifted from disbelief to horror to something that might have been awe. When it was over, the CO looked at him for a long moment. Then he said that what Elias had done out there, Payback did not begin to cover it. The name stuck. Now, Elias stood beneath an oak tree on the grounds of the Naval Academy, security officers closing in around him, and he felt Marcus's dog tags warm against his chest. 36 years of carrying that weight. 36 years of hearing those last words echo through every quiet moment. "Get them, brother. Make them pay." He had spent his career honoring that command. He had trained hundreds of SEALs, passed on everything Marcus had taught him, built a legacy of warriors who would never know the name of the man who had shaped their instructors. And when the violence finally drained out of him, when Elena convinced him to come home, he had believed that maybe the debt was paid. But debts like that were never really paid. They just changed form. The security officer's hand closed around his arm, and Elias let himself be moved. There was no fight left in him. There had not been for a long time. He had walked 14 miles to watch his daughters from a distance, and even that small mercy was being taken away. He thought about Marcus. He thought about Elena. He thought about Sophia and Natalia, somewhere in those rows of white uniforms, about to become the officers he had always known they could be. And he let go. The security officer pulled him away from the tree line, away from the ceremony grounds, away from everything he had walked so far to see. Kendrick watched with satisfaction. Another problem solved, another blemish removed from his perfect canvas. None of them noticed the Rear Admiral walking toward them across the lawn. Rear Admiral Theodore Marsh had learned many things during his 32 years in the Navy. He had learned that leadership was not about giving orders, but about earning the right to give them. He had learned that courage came in forms that had nothing to do with combat. He had learned that the men who talked loudest about their service were rarely the ones who had seen the worst of it. But the most important lesson he had ever learned came from a senior chief instructor at Coronado in the summer of 1991, during the darkest hours of BUD/S training, when Theodore Marsh was a 23-year-old lieutenant junior grade who was absolutely certain he was going to die. Hell Week, Day 4. The instructors had been running them through surf torture for what felt like hours. Waves crashing over their linked arms as the Pacific tried to steal the heat from their bodies 1 degree at a time. Marsh could not feel his legs. He could not feel his hands. He could barely feel the men beside him, their bodies shaking so hard the vibrations seemed to blur the line between one person and the next. He was going to quit. The thought had crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. He was going to stand up and walk to that bell and ring it 3 times, and this nightmare would be over. His body had simply reached its limit. There was no shame in that. Plenty of good men had reached their limits. He would find another path to serve his country. Then a voice cut through the roar of the surf. Not shouting, not angry, just calm and certain and impossible to ignore. The voice told him to get his head up, told him to look at the man on his left, then the man on his right, asked him if he saw them. Those were his brothers. They were not quitting. They were waiting for him to remember who he was. Marsh had turned his head, salt water streaming from his eyes that might have been tears or might have been ocean, and he had seen Senior Chief Elias Vance standing at the water's edge. The instructor's face was unreadable, but his eyes held something that Marsh had never forgotten. Not pity, not disappointment, just absolute conviction that Theodore Marsh was better than the weakness whispering in his ear. The voice told him that being a SEAL was not about strength. It was about will. His body wanted to quit. His body was a liar. The only question that mattered was whether he was going to listen to the lie. Marsh did not quit. He made it through Hell Week. He made it through BUD/S. He made it through 32 years of service that had taken him from the teams to command positions to a flag officer's stars. And every single day of that journey, he had carried Senior Chief Vance's words with him like a compass pointing toward true north. The Senior Chief had retired in 1997. Marsh had tried to stay in touch, but Vance had always been a private man, uncomfortable with recognition, allergic to anything that resembled glory-seeking. They had exchanged Christmas cards for a few years. Then Vance's wife had gotten sick, and the cards stopped coming, and eventually the silence stretched so long that Marsh assumed the worst. Now he walked across the Naval Academy lawn toward a commotion that should not have concerned him, drawn by something he could not name, watching security personnel escort an elderly homeless man away from the ceremony grounds. The man moved with a strange compliance, allowing himself to be led without resistance. But his spine was straight. His shoulders were square. His weight was balanced in a way that spoke of training so deep it had become instinct. Marsh quickened his pace. Commander Kendrick noticed the approaching flag officer and immediately shifted into a different mode. His voice took on the crisp deference that junior officers learned to deploy around admirals. He reported that they had a minor situation under control, sir. A vagrant who had been loitering near the VIP sight lines. Security was escorting him off the grounds now. Marsh barely heard him. His attention was fixed on the old man being led away, on the weathered face and wild gray hair, on the posture that 32 years had not erased from his memory. He asked the security officers to hold. They stopped. Everyone stopped. When a rear admiral spoke, people listened. Marsh moved closer, studying the old man's face. The years had not been kind. Decades of sun and wind, and something harder than either had carved deep lines into features that Marsh remembered as sharp and commanding. But the eyes were the same, pale blue and absolutely steady, carrying depths that most people never learned to read. Marsh spoke a single word. Senior Chief. Elias looked at him. For a long moment, neither man moved. Kendrick watched the exchange with growing confusion. He asked if the admiral knew this individual. His tone suggested that such knowledge would be unfortunate, possibly embarrassing, certainly inconvenient. Marsh did not answer. He was still looking at Elias, still trying to reconcile the legend he remembered with a broken man standing before him. His voice came out rough when he finally spoke again. He said it was him, was it not? Coronado, Class 185. Marsh said that Vance had pulled him out of the surf during Hell Week, had told him that the only failure was quitting. Something shifted in Elias's expression, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. He looked at Marsh, really looked at him, and the faintest ghost of recognition moved across his features. He spoke the admiral's name, just the last name, Marsh. His voice made it sound like a question and an answer at the same time. Marsh nodded. Tears were forming in his eyes, and he did not care who saw them. He said yes. Lieutenant Junior Grade Theodore Marsh. The kid who almost rang out on day 4 because he could not feel his legs. The security officers exchanged uncertain glances. Kendrick's face had gone pale, his certainty crumbling around him like a sand castle meeting the tide. Marsh turned to face the commander. His voice carried the weight of 32 years of authority. He said to release this man immediately. Then he turned back to Elias, and his voice cracked on the next words. He said it was really him. Payback. After all these years. The name hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Payback. 2 syllables that meant nothing to most of the people standing on that lawn, but everything to those who knew. Petty Officer Reyes felt her breath catch. She had heard that call sign before. Every sailor who had served anywhere near the Special Operations community had heard it. The stories varied in their details, but never in their essence. A senior chief who had trained a generation of SEALs. An operator who had done things in Panama and Desert Storm and a dozen other places that would never appear in any official history. A legend who had disappeared into retirement and then simply vanished, as if the man had been swallowed by the same shadows he had once moved through. She looked at the homeless man with new eyes. The torn jacket, the weathered face, the boots held together with tape, and underneath all of it, the bearing that she had recognized from the beginning without understanding what she was seeing. Kendrick stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his carefully constructed authority dissolving around him. He tried to speak, to reassert some measure of control over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his comprehension. He said there must be some mistake. He said this man was clearly homeless, clearly disturbed, clearly not what the admiral seemed to think he was. Marsh turned to face him. The tears were still visible on his cheeks, but his voice had hardened into something that commanders throughout the fleet would have recognized. The voice of a flag officer who was about to make someone's life extremely uncomfortable. He asked Kendrick what his name was, his rank, his position. He asked how long Kendrick had been coordinating academy events. He asked if it was standard protocol to physically remove elderly veterans from public viewing areas without verifying their identity. Kendrick stammered through his answers. Commander Bryce Kendrick, 17 years in the Navy, 11 months preparing for this specific ceremony. And no, sir, it was not standard protocol, but the circumstances had seemed clear. The individual had been uncooperative. The VIP sight lines had been compromised. Marsh cut him off. He said he did not want excuses. He wanted Kendrick to understand exactly who he had just tried to remove from these grounds. He turned back to Elias, and his voice softened. He asked if it was really true. 6 years on the streets. The senior chief who had shaped more SEALs than anyone could count, living under a bridge somewhere. Elias did not answer directly. His eyes had moved past Marsh, past Kendrick, past all of them, back toward the ceremony grounds where rows of white uniforms waited for the proceedings to begin. He said his daughters were graduating today, Sophia and Natalia Vance. He said he just wanted to see them. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, rippling outward through everyone who heard them. Reyes felt something tighten in her chest. Even one of the security officers, a young petty officer 3rd class who had been ready to drag Elias off the grounds 5 minutes earlier, looked away with sudden shame. Marsh processed this information with the focused intensity of a man who had spent decades making rapid assessments in crisis situations. The Vance twins. He knew those names. Everyone at the academy knew those names. 2 sisters who had torn through every academic and physical challenge the academy could offer, who were graduating today with honors and commissions that would launch them into careers their peers could only dream about. He asked Elias why. Why the streets? Why the silence? Why abandon 2 daughters who had clearly never stopped looking for him? Elias's composure finally cracked. Not dramatically, not completely, but enough. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. He said Elena died, his wife, 6 years ago, and when she went, she took everything that made him human. He said he looked at his daughters, and all he could see was her. All he could feel was the hole where she used to be. He said he thought he was protecting them by leaving. He thought his grief would poison them if he stayed. He said he was wrong. He knew that now. He had known it for years. But by the time he understood what he had done, he could not find a way back. The shame was too heavy. The distance was too far. So he watched from the shadows instead. He tracked their achievements. He showed up at the edges of their lives. He let himself believe that seeing them succeed was enough. His hand moved to his chest, pressing against the dog tags, and the wedding ring hidden beneath his ruined jacket. He said today was the last time. He was going to watch them graduate, and then he was going to disappear for good. Let them live their lives without the ghost of a father they probably hated. Marsh shook his head. He said that was not true. He said he had met the Vance twins during a career day presentation last year. Two brilliant young women who had spoken about their father with nothing but love and pride. They had told Marsh that their dad had been a SEAL, that he had taught them about the stars, that they had joined the Navy to honor his legacy. They had said they were still looking for him. Elias closed his eyes. A single tear escaped down his weathered cheek, cutting a clean path through the grime. Marsh stepped closer. His voice dropped low, meant only for Elias. He said the ceremony started in 20 minutes. He said there was time to make this right. He asked if Elias was ready to stop running. The question hung between them. 32 years of shared history, a debt that Marsh had never been able to repay, and now perhaps a chance to try. In the VIP section, Senator Chun checked her watch. On the stage, the Academy superintendent reviewed his notes. Across the ceremony grounds, two young women in white uniforms sat with their classmates, unaware that their world was about to change forever. And at the edge of the public viewing area, beneath an oak tree that had witnessed a century of graduations, a broken man stood at the crossroads of his life. Elias could feel the weight of every choice he had ever made pressing down on his shoulders. The choice to enlist at 17 against his mother's wishes. The choice to volunteer for BUD/S when safer paths were available. The choice to keep going into the darkness long after most men would have stopped. The choice to marry Elena when the teams told him marriage was a liability. The choice to retire when his body started failing him. The choice to leave his daughters alone with their grief, because his own grief had become a monster he could not control. Every choice had led him here, to this moment, to this lawn, to an admiral he had trained 3 decades ago, asking him if he was ready to stop running. He thought about what running had cost him. 5 years, 11 months, and 23 days of watching his daughters from the shadows. Birthdays he had observed from across parking lots. Achievements he had celebrated alone under bridges with no one to share them. The slow accumulation of distance that had calcified into something that felt permanent, insurmountable, irreversible. He thought about Elena, her voice in his memory, speaking her last words with a certainty that death could not diminish. Go back to them, Eli. Promise me. They need their father. He had broken that promise. He had broken it every single day for almost 6 years. And now here was a chance to start keeping it. And he was terrified in a way that combat had never made him terrified. In combat, the worst thing that could happen was death. Here, the worst thing that could happen was rejection. His daughters looking at him with the hatred he deserved, telling him he had forfeited any right to call himself their father. Marsh watched him struggle. The admiral had seen that look before, on the faces of men standing at the edge of their limits, trying to decide whether to push through or surrender. He knew better than to push. Some decisions had to be made alone. The ceremony grounds were filling with the last sounds of preparation. Programs rustling, cameras adjusting, the band warming up with scattered notes that would soon become the traditional march. In 15 minutes, the chief of naval operations would take his seat and the proceedings would begin. Elias looked toward the rows of white uniforms. Somewhere in that sea of identical dress whites were 2 women who had his eyes and Elena's smile. 2 women who had chosen to follow his path despite everything he had done to push them away. 2 women who, according to Marsh, had never stopped believing he would come home. He thought about Marcus, about the last words his brother had spoken before the light went out of his eyes. Get them, brother. Make them pay. For 36 years, Elias had interpreted those words as a command for vengeance. He had built his legend around that interpretation, had spent 19 hours in the Panamanian jungle becoming the thing that enemies feared. But standing here now, with his daughters so close he could almost feel them, he wondered if he had understood Marcus wrong all along. Maybe the payment Marcus had demanded was not blood. Maybe it was living. Maybe it was honoring the sacrifice by refusing to waste the life that had been preserved. Maybe getting them meant getting back to the people who mattered the people worth fighting for, the people who made survival mean something. Elena had known. Elena had always known. That was why her last words had been about the girls, not about grief or loss or the unfairness of dying young. She had understood that the only way to honor love was to keep loving, even when it hurt, even when it seemed impossible, even when the easier path was to disappear into the darkness and let the world forget you existed. Elias opened his eyes. The fear was still there. It would probably always be there. But underneath, it was something stronger. Something that felt like the first breath after nearly drowning. Something that felt like hope. He looked at Marsh. His voice was steady when he spoke, steadier than it had been in years. He said he did not know if he could do this. He said he did not know if they would want him. He said he had been gone so long that he might as well be a stranger. Marsh nodded. He said he understood. He said no one could promise that this would be easy or that it would work out the way Elias hoped. But he also said that the senior chief had taught him something important a long time ago. That being a SEAL was not about strength. It was about will. The body wanted to quit. The body was a liar. The only question that mattered was whether you were going to listen to the lie. Elias almost smiled. His own words coming back to him across 3 decades. The lesson he had given to 1,000 young men who were ready to surrender, now offered back to him when he needed it most. He took a breath, then another. He felt the dog tags against his chest, Marcus and Elena both with him, both waiting to see what he would choose. He said okay. He said he was ready. He said he would stop running. Marsh put a hand on his shoulder. The touch was gentle but firm, the grip of a man who had learned long ago that sometimes presence mattered more than words. He told Elias to come with him. He said there was someone he needed to talk to before the ceremony started. They began to walk toward the VIP section, leaving Kendrick standing alone with his shattered certainty, leaving Reyes watching with tears in her eyes, leaving the security officers uncertain what they had just witnessed. And in the rows of white uniforms, Sophia Vance felt that strange prickle at the back of her neck again, the one that had been with her since childhood, the one that always told her when something important was about to happen. She turned in her seat, scanning the crowd, searching for something she could not name. Commander Kendrick watched them walk away and felt his career unraveling with every step they took. 17 years of service, 11 months of meticulous preparation, a reputation built on flawless execution and attention to detail. All of it crumbling because he had looked at a homeless man and seen only what he expected to see. He replayed the confrontation in his mind, searching for the moment where he could have made a different choice. The old man standing quietly at the edge of the viewing area. The automatic sir that should have told him something. The straight spine and balanced stance that Reyes had noticed from the beginning. The photograph of 2 little girls that Kendrick had mocked as probably stolen. The signs had been there. He had simply refused to read them. Reyes approached him carefully, the way you might approach an injured animal. She asked if he was all right, Commander. Kendrick did not answer. He was watching Marsh guide Elias toward the VIP section, watching heads turn as people noticed the unlikely pair, watching his perfect ceremony transform into something he no longer controlled. He asked Reyes who that man really was. Not the name. The story. What had he done to make a rear admiral cry? Reyes hesitated. Then she told him what she knew. She said the call sign Payback belonged to one of the most decorated SEALs in the history of the teams. She said he had earned it in Panama during Operation Just Cause, where his platoon was ambushed and 3 of his brothers were killed. She said he had spent 19 hours alone in the jungle hunting down every hostile responsible. She said the operation was still studied at the Naval Special Warfare Center as an example of what one man could accomplish when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. She said he had trained SEALs for almost a decade after that. Hundreds of operators who went on to serve in every conflict the nation had faced. She said there were admirals and master chiefs and combat veterans throughout the fleet who owed their careers to Senior Chief Elias Vance. She said he had retired in the late 90s and disappeared. Rumors said his wife had died. Rumors said he had lost himself in grief. But no one knew for certain because men like him did not talk about their pain. Kendrick listened to all of it with a growing sense of horror. He had called this man a vagrant. He had accused him of stolen valor. He had mocked his claim to have daughters graduating today and threatened to have him arrested. He asked Reyes what happened now. What happened to officers who humiliated living legends in front of flag officers and senators and news cameras? Reyes did not have an answer for that. Across the lawn, Marsh was making introductions. The CNO's aide had intercepted them near the VIP section, alarmed by the sight of a homeless man being escorted toward the most senior officials in attendance. Marsh explained the situation in quiet tones, and the aide's expression shifted from concern to disbelief to something approaching reverence. Word began to spread. Whispered conversations rippled through the VIP section like wind through tall grass. The name Payback passed from person to person, accompanied by fragments of stories that had become legend. Panama, Desert Storm, Coronado, the senior chief who had shaped a generation. Senator Chen looked up from her notes, her political instincts immediately recognizing that something significant was happening. She caught Marsh's eye and raised an eyebrow in question. Marsh responded with a small nod that conveyed more than words could. The superintendent of the academy approached, a tall captain with silver at his temples and the measured bearing of a man accustomed to ceremony. He asked Marsh what was going on, and Marsh told him. The superintendent looked at Elias for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. He said it was an honor to meet the senior chief. He said he had heard stories about Payback since his own days as a midshipman. He said if the senior chief's daughters were graduating today, then the academy had been blessed to have them. Elias shook the offered hand. His grip was still strong despite everything. He thanked the superintendent and said his daughters had earned their own way. He said he had nothing to do with it. The superintendent smiled. He said that was not entirely true. He said he had read Sophia and Natalia Vance's application essays. Both of them had written about their father. Both of them had described a man who taught them about duty and sacrifice and the stars. Both of them had said their greatest dream was to make him proud. Elias felt something break open inside his chest. Not painfully this time, more like a door that had been locked for 6 years, finally swinging open. He asked if he could see them. His voice cracked on the words. He asked if there was time before the ceremony. The superintendent checked his watch. 10 minutes until the official start. Protocol demanded that the midshipmen remain in formation. Families were not permitted to approach until after the ceremony concluded. But protocol, the superintendent said, had certain flexibility when legends were involved. He turned to his aide and gave instructions. Find midshipmen Sophia and Natalia Vance. Bring them to the VIP section immediately. Do not explain why. The aide saluted and disappeared into the crowd. Elias stood very still, his heart pounding harder than it had during any operation, any firefight, any moment of his entire career. In a few minutes, he would see his daughters face to face for the first time in almost 6 years. He had no idea what he would say. He had no idea if they would even want to speak to him. But he was done running. Whatever came next, he would face it standing up. Sophia Vance had learned to trust the prickle at the back of her neck. It had warned her before ambush drills during summer training. It had alerted her to instructors watching from hidden positions during field exercises. It had told her when tests would be harder than expected and when roommates needed someone to talk to. The sensation had been with her since childhood, a gift she had never been able to explain, but had long ago stopped questioning. Now it was screaming. She scanned the crowd again, searching for the source of her unease. Families filled the viewing areas in their finest clothes. Cameras and phones were raised and ready. Distinguished guests occupied the VIP section with the practiced ease of people accustomed to ceremony. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing seemed wrong. But something was different. Something had shifted in the air itself. Natalia noticed her sister's distraction. She leaned close and asked what was wrong in a whisper that would not carry to their classmates. Sophia shook her head. She said she did not know. She said it felt like something was about to happen. Natalia followed her sister's gaze toward the VIP section. She saw admirals and senators and academy officials clustered in conversation. She saw a tall figure in a torn jacket standing among them. Incongruous and impossible, like a shadow that had wandered into a photograph. She blinked, looked again. The figure was still there. She grabbed Sophia's arm. Her grip was tight enough to leave marks. Sophia turned to ask what was wrong and saw her sister's face. Natalia had gone pale, her eyes fixed on something in the distance, her lips moving without sound. Sophia followed her gaze. She saw the VIP section. She saw the admirals and the officials. She saw the figure in the torn jacket, and her heart stopped beating. It could not be him. It was impossible. They had searched for almost 6 years. They had hired private investigators. They had contacted every veterans organization on the East Coast. They had posted flyers and made phone calls and never stopped believing he was alive, but they had never found a single trace of him. And now he was standing in the VIP section of their graduation ceremony, surrounded by flag officers, looking like he had walked out of a nightmare and into a dream. The superintendent's aide appeared at the edge of their row. He spoke to the officer coordinating the midshipman formation, showed credentials, exchanged words that Sophia could not hear over the roaring in her ears. Then the aide was gesturing to them, beckoning them to follow, and Sophia was on her feet without remembering the decision to stand. Natalia rose beside her. They moved in unison, the way they had moved their entire lives, two halves of a whole that had never quite learned to function separately. Their classmates watched them go with confused expressions. This was not protocol. Midshipmen did not leave formation before ceremony. But Sophia and Natalia were no longer thinking about protocol. They followed the aide through the crowd, weaving between families and folding chairs, their white uniforms drawing glances and murmurs. The distance to the VIP section was perhaps 50 meters. It felt like miles. It felt like years. Sophia could see him more clearly now. The gray hair that had been dark brown the last time she saw him. The weathered face that had aged decades in less than 6 years. The jacket held together with tape and hope. The posture that was still somehow straight, still somehow military, despite everything the world had done to him. Her father who had vanished 3 weeks after her mother's funeral and left nothing but a note and an empty space that had never stopped hurting. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. She wanted to hit him and hold him and demand to know why he had left them alone with their grief when they needed him most. She kept walking, one foot in front of the other, the same discipline he had taught her before she was old enough to understand what discipline meant. The crowd in the VIP section parted as they approached. Sophia saw Rear Admiral Marsh, whose career day presentation had moved her to tears last year when he spoke about the instructor who had saved him during Hell Week. She saw the superintendent, watching them with an expression that mixed pride with something softer. She saw her father standing among them like a ghost made flesh, his eyes fixed on her and Natalia with an intensity that stopped her breath. They stood 10 feet apart. The distance might as well have been an ocean. Elias opened his mouth to speak. The words would not come. 6 years of silence had stolen his voice when he needed it most. He tried again, and what emerged was barely a whisper. He said their names. Sophia, Natalia. He said them like prayers, like apologies, like the first words of a language he had forgotten how to speak. Sophia felt tears streaming down her face. She did not wipe them away. She did not care who saw. She asked the only question that mattered. Her voice broke on every syllable. She asked why. Why did he leave? Why did he stay away? Why did he let them think he might be dead when they never stopped looking, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing he would come home? Elias felt the question cut through him like shrapnel. He deserved it. He deserved every ounce of pain in her voice and more. He said he was sorry. He said it was not enough, would never be enough, but it was all he had. He said losing Elena had broken something inside him that he did not know how to fix. He said he thought leaving would protect them from the wreckage of what he had become. He said he was wrong. He said he had been wrong every single day for almost 6 years. He said he had watched them from a distance, had tracked their achievements, had shown up at the edges of their lives, because he could not stay away completely even though he believed they were better off without him. He said he understood if they hated him. He said he would leave right now if that was what they wanted. He said he just needed them to know that he never stopped loving them. Not for 1 second. Not for one breath. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Sophia had ever heard. Natalia moved first. She had always been the one who led with her heart, while Sophia led with her head. She had always been the one who forgave quickly and loved fiercely and refused to let logic override emotion. She crossed the 10 feet between them in 3 steps and threw her arms around her father. The impact nearly knocked Elias off his feet. He was not prepared for it. He had braced himself for rejection, for anger, for the cold distance he deserved. He had not braced himself for his daughter's arms wrapped around him so tight he could barely breathe. Natalia was crying. He could feel her tears soaking through his ruined jacket, could feel her shoulders shaking against his chest, could feel 6 years of grief and hope and desperate searching pouring out of her in waves. She said she knew he was alive. She told him she never stopped believing. She said she woke up every morning and checked her phone hoping today would be the day. She said she had dreams where he came back and nightmares where he never did. She said she was so angry at him, so angry she could scream. But she was also so grateful he was here, so grateful she could touch him and know he was real. Sophia stood apart, watching. Her tears had not stopped, but her feet would not move. The anger and the love were at war inside her, and she did not know which one would win. Elias looked at her over Natalia's shoulder. He saw the battle in her eyes. He understood it better than she knew. He said her name, just her name, Sophia. He said he was not asking for forgiveness. He was not asking for anything. He just wanted her to know that every achievement she had earned, every obstacle she had overcome, every step she had taken toward this day, he had watched with more pride than he had words to express. He said she looked so much like her mother it made his heart break and heal at the same time. Something cracked in Sophia's composure. The wall she had built to protect herself from hoping, from disappointment, from the pain of loving someone who had abandoned her. It did not crumble all at once, but it cracked. She stepped forward. One step, then another. Then she was there beside her sister, and her arms were around her father, and for the first time in almost 6 years the 3 of them were together. The VIP section had gone silent. Admirals and senators and academy officials stood witness to a reunion that none of them had expected to see. Rear Admiral Marsh wiped his eyes without embarrassment. The superintendent turned away to compose himself. Even Senator Chun, known throughout Washington for her unflappable demeanor, had to blink rapidly several times. Elias held his daughters and felt something shift inside him. The darkness that had lived in his chest since Elena's death did not disappear. It was still there, would probably always be there, but it was no longer alone. There was light now, too. There was warmth. There was the solid reality of 2 young women who had every reason to hate him and had chosen to hold him instead. He whispered that he was sorry. He whispered it over and over, the words muffled against their hair, meaningless and essential all at once. He said he would spend the rest of his life trying to earn this moment. He said he did not deserve them, but he would try every day to become someone who did. Sophia pulled back just enough to look at him. Her eyes were red, her cheeks wet, her composure shattered. But underneath the tears was something else, something that looked like the beginning of peace. She said they did not want his apologies. She said they had spent 6 years imagining what they would say if they ever found him. All the accusations, all the questions, all the pain they had stored up waiting for a target. But now that he was here, she said, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that he was alive. The only thing that mattered was that he had come back. She said they wanted their father. That was all they had ever wanted. Natalia nodded fiercely, still pressed against his chest, still refusing to let go. She asked if he was staying this time. Her voice was small, childlike, the voice of an 8-year-old girl in a sailor dress who had worshipped her father before she understood what worship meant. Elias tightened his arms around them. He thought about the bridge where he had been sleeping, the docks where he had been working, the shadows where he had been hiding for almost 6 years. He said yes. He said he was staying. He said if they would have him, he was never leaving again. The ceremony was supposed to start in 5 minutes. Protocol demanded that the midshipmen return to formation. Schedules had been carefully constructed. Timelines had been meticulously planned. None of it mattered. The superintendent stepped forward. He spoke quietly to Marsh, who nodded. Then he addressed Elias and his daughters. He said there was a seat in the front row that had just become available. He said it would be an honor if Senior Chief Vance would watch his daughters graduate from a place where they could see him. Elias looked at Sophia. He looked at Natalia. He saw their faces, so like Elena's, shining with tears and hope and something that might have been joy. He said he would like that. He said he would like that very much. The daughters released him reluctantly, wiping their eyes, straightening their uniforms. They had a graduation to attend. They had commissions to receive. They had the rest of their lives to rebuild what had been broken. But first, they had this moment. This impossible, beautiful, unexpected moment. And none of them intended to waste it. The graduation ceremony began under a sky so blue it seemed painted for the occasion. The Naval Academy band struck up the traditional march, and row after row of midshipmen rose to their feet in perfect unison, for years of training visible in every synchronized movement. Elias sat in the front row of the VIP section, a seat that had been occupied minutes earlier by a diplomat who had graciously relocated when the superintendent made his request. The torn jacket and weathered boots looked impossibly out of place among the dress uniforms and tailored suits surrounding him. He did not care. For the first time in almost 6 years, he did not feel out of place at all. Sophia and Natalia had returned to their positions in the formation, their eyes red, but their bearing impeccable. Every few moments, one of them would glance toward the front row, as if confirming that their father was still there, that he had not vanished again like smoke in the wind. Each time, Elias met their eyes. Each time, he tried to communicate everything he could not say aloud. I am here. I am staying. I love you. The ceremony proceeded with the precision that defined everything the Academy did. The superintendent delivered his address, speaking of duty and honor and the weight of the commissions about to be bestowed. Senator Chun took the podium and spoke of sacrifice and service, her words carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in the chambers where war and peace were decided. The Chief of Naval Operations spoke last. He talked about the legacy of those who had worn the uniform before, the giants on whose shoulders every new officer would stand. He talked about the challenges ahead and the courage required to face them. Elias listened to all of it, but his attention never truly left his daughters. He watched them stand at attention with the same discipline he had tried to teach them before they could walk. He watched them respond to commands with voices that carried across the parade ground. He watched them become officers in the United States Navy, and he felt a pride so profound it threatened to crack his ribs. Elena should have been here. The thought came unbidden, bringing with it a wave of grief that never fully receded. She should have been sitting beside him, clutching his hand, crying the happy tears she had always cried at moments like this. She should have seen what their daughters had become. But she was here in a way. She was in Sophia's determined jaw and Natalia's fierce eyes. She was in the grace with which they moved and the strength with which they stood. She was in every choice they had made that led them to this day. Elias touched the wedding ring hanging beside his dog tags. Still here, Elena. Still watching over them. You will be so proud. The commissioning portion of the ceremony began. Names were called alphabetically, and one by one the midshipmen crossed the stage to receive their commissions as ensigns in the United States Navy. Families cheered. Cameras flashed. The weight of tradition settled over the proceedings like a benediction. When the announcer reached the letter V, Elias leaned forward in his seat. Mishibman Natalia Elena Vance. The middle name hit him like a physical blow. Elena. They had given her Elena's name. He had not known. He had watched from such a distance, had kept himself so separate that he had not known his daughter carried her mother's name. Natalia crossed the stage with perfect poise. She shook the superintendent's hand, received her commission, and turned to face the audience. Her eyes found her father immediately. She smiled. It was Elena's smile, exactly Elena's smile, and Elias had to press his hand against his mouth to keep from making a sound. Midshipman Sophia Marie Vance. Marie, Elena's mother's name. Another piece of family woven into the fabric of who his daughters had become. Sophia crossed the stage with the same measured confidence her sister had shown. She received her commission and turned, and her eyes found her father too. She did not smile. She did something better. She snapped a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. She was not saluting the VIPs. She was not saluting the flag. She was saluting him. The front row of the VIP section noticed. Rear Admiral Marsh rose to his feet. The superintendent stood beside him. One by one, every officer in the section rose, turning toward Elias, offering salutes of their own. It spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Veterans in the family section stood. Active duty personnel scattered throughout the audience stood. Even civilians who understood what was happening rose to their feet in recognition. For Senior Chief Elias Vance, call sign Payback, father of ensigns Natalia and Sophia Vance, a man who had given everything to his country and then lost himself in grief, but who had found his way back when it mattered most. Elias stood slowly, his legs unsteady, his vision blurred with tears. He did not know what to do with his hands. He did not know what to do with the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He raised his own hand in a salute. It was rusty, unpracticed, the muscle memory of decades fighting against years of disuse. But it was there. It was still there. The applause that followed was not the polite appreciation that accompanied most graduation ceremonies. It was something raw, something that came from the gut. It was the sound of people recognizing something true. Elias held the salute until his arm trembled. Then he lowered it, and he wept without shame as his daughters ran toward him across the parade ground. Graduation caps flying, white uniforms bright against the perfect blue sky. 3 months later, Elias stood on the balcony of a small apartment in Annapolis and watched the sun set over the Chesapeake Bay. The water caught the fading light and scattered it into 1,000 shades of orange and gold, the same colors that had painted so many evenings on the porch of the home he had shared with Elena. The apartment belonged to Sophia and Natalia. They had insisted he stay with them until he found his footing, and he had learned that arguing with his daughters was as pointless as arguing with the tide. The spare bedroom had become his, furnished with a real bed and clean sheets and a window that looked out over the harbor where he had once hauled cargo for day wages. The first weeks had been difficult. His body had forgotten what regular meals and consistent sleep felt like. His mind had forgotten how to exist in spaces that were not shadows. There were nights when he woke gasping, certain that the walls were closing in, certain that he did not deserve the warmth surrounding him. There were mornings when the urge to run was so strong he had to grip the edge of the bed until his knuckles went white. But his daughters were there. They were patient in ways he had never taught them to be. They gave him space when he needed it and presence when he needed that instead. They learned to read his silences and to fill them with their own voices, telling him about their lives, their training, their hopes for careers that stretched out before them like open water. He learned that Natalia had been assigned to a destroyer out of Norfolk. She would ship out in 6 weeks, her first deployment, the beginning of a journey that would take her to places he had been and places he had never seen. She was nervous and excited and trying to pretend she was neither. He learned that Sophia had been selected for the nuclear submarine program, one of the most competitive billets in the Navy. She would spend the next 2 years in training before she ever set foot on a boat. She approached it with the same relentless determination she had shown her entire life. He learned that they had kept his old astronomy book, the battered paperback he had carried through every deployment, the same one his father had given him, the same one he had used to teach them about the constellations when they were small. They had found it in his study after he disappeared and had taken turns keeping it safe, passing it back and forth like a sacred relic. The therapy sessions had started in the second week. The VA had a program for veterans dealing with complicated grief, and Marsh had made a phone call that cut through months of waiting lists. Elias went reluctantly at first, then with increasing willingness as he discovered that speaking the pain aloud did not make it larger. It made it smaller. It gave it edges he could hold. He talked about Marcus, about the jungle, about the 19 hours that had turned him into a legend and hollowed out something essential in his soul. He talked about Elena, about the way her death had broken him in places he did not know could break. He talked about the years under the bridge, the day labor, the watching from shadows. And slowly, painfully, he began to heal. Commander Kendrick had resigned his commission 3 weeks after the graduation. The video of the confrontation had spread across the internet like wildfire, and no amount of damage control could undo what millions of people had witnessed. Elias took no satisfaction in the man's downfall. Kendrick had seen what he expected to see. Most people did. The tragedy was not that he had been cruel. The tragedy was that cruelty had become so easy, so automatic, so unremarkable. Marsh visited every few weeks. They would sit on the balcony and watch the water and talk about the old days, about the men they had trained and the missions they had survived. Sometimes they did not talk at all. Sometimes presence was enough. The superintendent had offered Elias a position at the academy. A consulting role, nothing strenuous, just sharing his experience with the next generation of officers. Elias had not said yes yet. He was not sure he was ready, but he had not said no either. The balcony door opened behind him, and Natalia stepped out carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to her father and leaned against the railing beside him. She asked what he was thinking about. Elias considered the question. He was thinking about Elena, as he always was. He was thinking about Marcus, whose dog tag still hung around his neck. He was thinking about the years he had lost and the years he might still have. He said he was thinking about stars. He asked if she remembered the summer he taught her and Sophia to find Polaris. Natalia smiled. She said she remembered everything. She said those were the best nights of her childhood, lying on a blanket in the backyard while their father pointed at the sky and told them stories about ancient sailors who navigated by starlight. Elias felt something warm spread through his chest. Not happiness exactly. He was not sure he remembered what happiness felt like, but something close, something adjacent, something that might grow into happiness if he gave it enough time. He asked if she would like to do it again sometime. Just the 3 of them. A blanket, the old astronomy book, the stars. Natalia's eyes filled with tears. She nodded without speaking and leaned her head against his shoulder. They stood together as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear. Somewhere out there, Elena was watching. Somewhere out there, Marcus was at peace. And here, on this balcony, a broken man was learning to be whole again. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that it is never too late to find your way back to the people who love you, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember that the people who love you never stop looking. Every person you pass on the street carries a story. Some of them might just be trying to find their way home. Thank you for watching.